Okay, here we go with the labor movement. So here we're going to discuss and define the various phases of development of the labor movement from the 1860s to 1955. In your discussion, demonstrate how the philosophy of social Darwinism, the lecture we covered before, impeded the labor movement. It is also important to show how tensions between capital and labor led to industrial conflict and the results of that conflict. So learning objective 1 wants us to discuss the division within the labor movement and show how labor had a hard time adjusting to industrial capitalism. So what's important to understand here is in the years after the Civil War, you're going to have these two rival approaches fighting for allegiances of the American working classes. You're going to have the radical unions and you're going to have the trade unions. So the American labor failed to achieve satisfactory adjustments to industrial capitalism during the years following the Civil War, largely because it was unable to act as a unit to agree upon these three issues: the nature of the problem, the proper objectives, and the instrument of action. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century, labor debated whether to accept or reject capitalism and whether to trust laissez-faire, which means hands off the economy, government hands off the economy, and try to make it their own, or seek government patronage, assistance as a mediator. One of the fundamental problems for labor was that machinery, technology had advanced and made enormous savings in manufacturing and vast increases in productivity. But only a small portion of these savings, if any, were passed on to labor in the form of wages. It is estimated workers' purchasing power increased nearly 40% between 1850 and 1880. However, labor argued it was not getting its fair share of the fruits of industrial growth. Instead, the rich were getting far richer as the poor were getting far poorer. So another issue that labor is going to confront during this time is as machinery technology comes to represent a larger capital investment, it was thought necessary to have the worker adjust to the machinery rather than have the machinery adjust to the worker. Thus, if efficiency required that machines run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it was the worker who was expected to adjust themselves to that requirement, regardless of any social undesirability or sentiments of such a grueling schedule. So, for example, the steel industry had a 12-hour day, so you work 12 hours, and then you also work 7 days a week. And this schedule was maintained for many workers up until 1923. The other thing that labor is going to have a hard time adjusting to is the change from the individual employer to the impersonal corporation. It's going to sharply lessen the workers' bargaining power. So when machines took the place of handicraft jobs, the work is going to become monotonous, and mechanization undermined both the pride a craftsman or an artisan would have put into his work, and as a result, his bargaining power. The old familiar relations between employer and employee were rapidly passing during this time. So a few generations before, the boss had known everyone in the shop, because in the small establishment there had been basically friendly human relationships, as friendly as they can get at a workplace, right, between the employer and the employee. In the industrial age, though, the time period that we're looking at here, there was no relationship between the great mines or the steel producers who controlled the coal industry and the 150,000 men who worked in those mines. So as a result of industrialization and the rapid growth of the industrial workforce, the problem of the loss of identity within society for a large number of workers developed, and this is referred to as alienation. the individual became less significant. So this is where labor unions would step in to provide that significance. Right? You cannot negotiate if you're one of 100,000 workers as an individual, but you can negotiate with your worker if that 100,000 worker pool is doing the negotiation in one solid voice or solidarity. But the problem for these unions, radical unions and trade unions, and I'll give examples of those in the next learning objective, but just for now, looking at the issues, looking at the nature of the problem, radical unions are going to point their fingers at the entire system, the corporate capitalist system, where trade unions are going to say the problem lies with management. For radical unions, the solution, the proper objective, is to reject the corporate capitalist system. For trade unions, the proper objective is to adjust. For radical unions, more or less, the instrument of action was the passive appeal to reason. And for trade unions, it's going to be striking. And then we're going to look at specific examples in the next learning objective of how this applied.